Hello, everyone. My name is Forrest Wilson, and I'm a third-year MFA candidate in the Studio Art and Design track of the Emerging Media program at UCF. So first, I'd like to take this time to thank my committee, the UCF Art Gallery, the program director, Jason Burrell, and everyone involved with the installation and preparation for the thesis show, Florida Rome, without whom none of this would be possible. I'd especially like to thank my thesis chair, Wanda Raimundi Ortiz, and my thesis committee members, Shannon Ray Lindsay and Dr. Elenia Colon Mendoza. My thesis is entitled Eden Inflamed, an examination of the self through fantastical figures. So my defense overview, this thesis defense will go over both the concerns of my work and my research as it pertains to the past, its ability to shift or remain hidden in the form of memory and history, as well as remaining a constant inspiration and tool that I return to for the creation of my artwork. Religious mythology, as well as religious trauma in regards to my research and experiences, the principles of camp as an aesthetic style and characterization method, poetry and symbolism in the service of open-ended storytelling and non-linear world building, as well as the practice of character creation as a method of self-expression and empowerment. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to present my work and the ideas which motivate and inform it. I will also share personal stories, poetry, to allow for a more intimate understanding of my work. Furthermore, to expand upon the role that history and memory play within my process, and thinking, I will be making comparisons between my work, Mannerist artworks from the 16th and 17th century, and relevant contemporary artworks, processes, and artists. Interspersed throughout my presentation, I will also be sharing quotes from Susan Sontag's Notes on Camp and sections of the poem Letting Go by Chicana, queer, and feminist poet and theorist Gloria Anzaldúa in relation to some of my latest work. As an artist, my work provides validation. I'm a man who identifies as queer and has experiences of feeling unloved and unwelcome. Negative emotions which stem from my childhood, my time spent in the US foster care system caused me to feel inferior or unworthy of a normative experience of growing up. A system relying heavily on Christian-centered homes to raise its wards. This problematic relationship between a government-run service and Christian values insists a necessity of faith upon the children in their care. For many, religion can provide structure, hope, and supplements them with a sensation of divine love to compensate for the lack of love they might not be receiving. I'm sorry. However, for queer children, it can cause a crisis of self-hatred and shame. Through my practice, I confront my personal history using the fantastical symbolic imagery associated with both religion and power, in order to personally explore the possibilities of my own emotional and psychological expression. So the first series I'm going to be talking about is a series titled Damaged Goods, the title of which comes from a personal story. Around the time I was aging out of foster care, for those of you unfamiliar, when you turn 18, you age out of the foster care system and you're therefore responsible as an adult to take care of yourself fully. No help is required from anyone who's cared for you in the past. I was looking for a home and I'd asked a friend, and they were taken aback in the moment, and as a joke, they said to me, "You're really damaged goods." And it was intended as a joke and we laughed, but the kind of uncomfortable realization that I've been reduced to a joke to avoid uncomfortability, like uncomfortable situation where they had to ask for permission from their guardian if I could live with them, really hurt and stung over my time processing that information. So that began my series with these found objects. That was specifically the feelings I was trying to tap into when I created this first piece, Blue Dandy 1, oil on paper. All of these pieces are relatively small, under 10 inches, and they're intended to be intimate, metaphorical self-portraits. This is a comparison of that piece in Salman Tour's East Village apartment. So Salman Tour is an Iranian-born artist who came to the US in a post-9/11 world, living in New York. He identifies as gay, and he creates his work by exploring the safe spaces he's had to create, despite his history of being othered and and stereotyped by the nature of being an Iranian-born man living in the US after 9/11. So in this piece, he's clearly looking at the past, and in the same way, I'm doing that in this work as well, in my own work. So around this time, I started writing poetry, reflecting on my experiences of thinking about my childhood and how I could process and move forward from something that felt unchangeable. Cursed as you are to eternally digest your youth, and the sweet vomit upon which you will again regurgitate and choke. These are two pieces that are a bit more lighthearted. As I made more of these, the more humor I began to see in them, and the more I felt that they could exist beyond a place of pain or suffering or loneliness, and really begin to become more human in that way. I began to think a lot about the idea of immediate character, how I could really portray them as this kind of fabulous cast of characters that still didn't quite exist anywhere because they were based upon my identity and my memory. So the more I'd made, the more characters began to come out of things I didn't expect. So I made these flower paintings in which the flowers themselves become characters. It really becomes portraits of the flowers opening up, showing themselves, being vibrant and theatrical. At the same time, I was really exploring Susan Sontag's notes on camp. So this is a quote from Susan Sontag's notes on camp. What camp taste responds to is instant character. Character is understood as a state of continual incandescence, a person being one very intense thing. And at the same time, I made this connection with Mannerist portraiture by Bronzino at the time. So in the portraits by Bronzino, he uses this fabric as this way of taking the viewer out of time partially. Obviously, the costume is still a very clear indicator of the time and the place and the status of these figures, because in the end, it is also about status. It is about this presentation of something. And in a way, it's also about making them almost as an object. And I felt this really strong correlation between that and my work, and how I was thinking about myself as a child and how I felt like an object when I was out of control as a child. Even the fabric began to become a character. This is called butterfly silk. The essence of camp is its love of the unnatural, of artifice and exaggeration. At the same time, I was making portraits of my partner, placing him in this kind of void space, but also this emotional space that was constantly moving and changing, and the idea that they could be constantly in this state of moving. These are my larger piece. This is a larger piece that came out of that series, where I tried to combine both of the characters I was dealing with, the characters that came from my partner and the character of the dandy that was very prevalent in the earlier found objects paintings, the paintings of the found objects. These are 3 more paintings from that series towards the end of the series, where I was really exploring things that could go beyond my story, kind of characters I could relate to that didn't have anything directly to do with how I identified or how I thought. Some of them still based on my experiences of history, specifically the piece in the middle called Motherhood. As somebody who never felt like they had what society idealizes as a mother or what I idealize as a mother, kind of this kind of all-caring figure that I could go to, I could speak to, I could share things with, I could be open with, I could experience a hug, physical intimacy on some level, the way that we expect a mother, that way that we in society expect a mother to, that I really always felt at odds with. So this character is, again, sitting in this kind of void, nondescript space, and she's holding the baby that doesn't have a face. And her expression is not one of clear connection to the child or of what I would call love or what I would define as love. So returning to the past, this is a piece I'd made in my undergrad, dealing with the same kind of idea. Here it's really this universal idea of a mother again, or this idealized mother that doesn't have an identity. She's surrounded by these eggs, she's surrounded by symbols of hope, and she's colored with these warm and cool pastels that really reflect the idea of resurrection as it connects to like Easter. Religion is a prevalent thing that I deal with, having grown up in, like, as I said before, heavily Christian homes. So this is a comparison of those two pieces. The one on the far right is much more, the one on the right is much more indicative of how I felt my actual experience of a mother was. While the one on the left is a lot more distant. So that brings me to Esteban Munoz's Utopia seating chart. Rather than being static and fixed, the past does things. It is in this very way that the past is performative. So returning to these objects that have meaning, cultural and historical meaning that goes beyond my identification with them as damaged goods or hand-me-downs, something that a lot of underprivileged children are very familiar with. I found myself placing the portraits within this space and trying to find the line between object, character, and portrait. I found a kinship in Salman Tour's Art Room piece. He also has a series called Fag Puddle, where he explores the difficulty he has with history in reflecting his experience as a queer man. So in these pieces, he's got his two of his characters that he's often described as doll-like, without their own kind of will, that exist in this space, inspired by this history of art, this art history, these busts and these statuettes that seem to depict both suffering and intimacy. And in the same way, I'm trying to do the same thing, less so from trying to be more open and just playful with these characters, though, really I'm still trying to capture a lost childhood, or what I felt I couldn't have as a child, like this opportunity to play, this opportunity to have this kind of joyful expression. So Little Fragile Things is the next series and the culmination of my thesis work with these found objects. So again, back to Susan Sontag. Camp taste nourishes itself on the love that has gone into certain objects and personal styles. The absence of this love is why such kitsch items aren't camp. So that brings me to an important distinction. I don't view these objects as kitsch, although many people would. I view them as camp because although there is a humor, there's an ironic humor to them. It's not a ha-ha, it's more of an indignant ha. They take on this role of these kind of cast of like a royal court of characters. And just to read off the materials list and how I kind of transformed them from the original state of damaged goods. So it's found objects, oil paint, paper, lace, fabric flowers, satin, gold gilding, silver leaf, and human hair. And again, the flower returns as this central character in a lot of my thesis work. Kind of going over the history of a found object and what it means to us as a society. A found object or found art is art created from undisguised but often modified items or products that are not normally considered materials from which art is made, often because they already have non-art function. So this idea of transforming something from utility by applying my own personal need for context, or what I think a viewer needs for context to understand them as something differently. I wanted to reference Chaim Steinbeck here. So Chaim Steinbeck's art is a staging of objects in formats that underscore their presence both anthropologically as well as aesthetically. These objects come from a spectrum of social and cultural contexts and are put together in a way that is analogous to the arrangement of words in a poem or to the musical notes in a score. Similarly, I'm trying to inject the sentimentality into these objects, as I said before, capturing what I feel like I couldn't have as a child. So this character on the far left that appeared in my paintings, the matador, and I call it the fabulous cock. This way that they're playing with this kind of this weird femme role that this rooster is playing, as well as this dominant, but also kind of silly matador. And again, the dandy on the far right being viewed by the cherub with the masquerade mask, who doesn't quite either doesn't know that he's being viewed or is ignoring the cherub. So they're kind of coquettish. And then the far left, the Blessed Virgin Mary figurine. And in the far back, there is a little baby angel that I related to. And so he's looking at her from behind, but she does not seem to notice or does not return the gaze purposefully. I mentioned human hair as one of the materials in the list, and it's my own hair. It's my way of bringing my adult self into this kind of child play zone, this kind of literal symbol of myself as an adult, but also, again, something I couldn't have as a child. I could not control the way I dressed. I could not control the kind of hair I was allowed to have as a child. I'd always loved long hair. I always thought it was really fabulous and fun and beautiful, and there was like a power to it, a power to like present how you want, but also bring in what you might desire. That brings me to Gloria Anzaldua's Letting Go. This concept of transformation is really important to this poem. It relates strongly to what I believe is my need for multiplicity, my need to move through my identity, feel the things I need to feel in moments, or be whatever I need to feel, whatever I need to relate to feel my own sense of power. As well as, again, that return to the past and this need to empty yourself of your past in some way, to purge yourself of it. It's not enough deciding to open. You must plunge your fingers into your navel with your own two hands split open, spill out the lizards and horned toads, the orchids and the sunflowers. Turn the maze inside out, shake it. Yet you don't quite empty. Maybe a green phlegm hides in your cough. You may not even know that it's there until a knot grows in your throat and turns into a frog. Grace, what is there to fall from? This was my work with pastel. I had done a lot of work with oil painting, but found that I needed something that I could really draw with. And pastel provided that for me while also affording me these rich kind of colors that I love to play with. It's called Fallen Angel, and it's pastel on paper. A lot of these ones are 13 by 17, these first ones that I'd done. In this one, I was using my partner as the form and like photography of my partner as a stepping point for this figure that I felt needed to be protected or was protecting something, and how I could turn it into this allegory that has a broad sense of that idea of protection, vulnerability, and especially as it relates to identity and, from my perspective, queer identity. This is a piece by Elena Perez. She's dealing heavily with her own past, although she's dealing with a lot of her own cultural past that I am not dealing with personally. I'm dealing with this fantasy in this way to transform my experiences, to transcend or transfigure. But a similarity that we definitely have is this use of the flower, as well as the anatomical anomalies that are going to be more apparent in some of the later pieces. So to define an allegory, a story, a poem, or picture that can be interpreted to reveal a hidden meaning. I was really thinking about an allegory of a codependent relationship when I was drawing these two flowers. Their forms kind of also mimic the porcelains or the found objects and their playful curling. The thorns are almost close enough to touch and hurt, but they don't ever. And in a way, the way that they coil supports each other. It's hard to imagine one existing without falling over if one were to die or leave the other. So in this piece, Vermilion Bird Shot in Flight, I was thinking about this betrayal and even this like filmographic point of view of what it feels like to be stabbed or hurt, betrayed. So this like fade to red, this fade to pink, that references passion as well as suffering. He returns our gaze, but there doesn't seem to be like accusation, just a questioning. And again, with the costuming and the styling of these characters, that might need to bring this kind of immediate sense of character, this immediate sense of identity through this codification of them. There's this bouffant and this cravat that are referential to the dandy figurine I played with in my earlier pieces. So to continue Gloria Anzaldua's poem. It tickles a secret smile on your palate, full of tiny orgasms. But sooner or later, it reveals itself. The green frog indiscreetly croaks. Everyone looks up. In this piece, A Test, I thought about all the times in my life I'd gone through a hard moment and been told by somebody, some authoritarian figure, that it's a test or that there's a plan. And I wanted to depict this moment of almost questioning. We know that the fingers are going to touch the flame, but there's this pensive kind of, not quite erotic, but maybe sentimental aspect to it. I thought a lot about the story of the burning bush that says, I am that I am, not to be questioned. In this piece, Allegory of Innocent Love, again, I was taking myself back to my childhood and thinking about something that I think a lot of us think about, is this idea that love can save us, or that there's someone out there who can save us. So this figure is at once empowered with the opera gloves and the boots, this costume that begins to form around them. They're at once a devil and a cherub. They're at once a child and an adult at the same time. But while that's going on, part of their form is also melting into this fire. So we don't know if it's fully empowering or beneficial in this figure's best interest. And again, I relate that to the way Alina Perez deals with her own idea of like childhood and an unhappy feelings of growing up. To correlate my piece with hers, I hadn't noticed this until recently when I looked at this piece, but there's a duckling being squashed underneath this donkey's foot. There's no question as to that duckling's fate, and the others scramble around, not in control of their circumstances, while this prepubescent girl either stirs this donkey on or is peeling back on him to stop. But there's definitely a determination in her face, a strong sense of character. It's not enough opening once. Again, you must plunge your fingers into your navel with your two hands rip open. Drop out dead rats and cockroaches, spring rain, young ears of corn. Turn the maze inside out, shake it. This not quite complementary imagery in that poem with the young ears of corn juxtaposed with the rats made me think of the vulnerability of giving a gift, or the vulnerability of love. And I wanted to personify that with this piece. I talk about a lot of these objects or things that I depict as a personification of something. And in that way, it also correlates to the idea of the allegory, the poem, the hidden meaning, that there is something internal that's being expressed, not just what's being shown. So this anxiety of the mark making behind the flower and even in the stem, while the bloom is very passionate and powerful and forthcoming. This time you must let go. Meet the dragon's open face and let the terror swallow you. You dissolve in its saliva. No one recognizes you as a puddle. No one misses you. You aren't even remembered. And the maze isn't even of your own making. This idea of the maze not being your own making, this idea of the lack of control. I was thinking about the future for that figure I depicted in Allegory of Innocent Love. What would happen when he discovers that this is not what love really is? When you put your faith in certain things, or I put a lot into this idea of a savior figure that at once appears friendly, but has over time, the more you look, the more you begin to perceive, the more intimate you become with them, the more you find malice and evil or dark intent. So this piece is called Carnivorous Lover, like a puddle through your fingers. And obviously there's this watery kind of thing that's going on with the figure. They're seeming to melt in the wings slash finger-like forms of this figure, this bird-like figure. So to correlate that with art history, these are two pieces done by Michelangelo Buonarroti, and they were intended as a gift for a young man he professed in sonnets and poems to love. We can never know fully the extent of this love. You know, our ideas of sexuality today are not the same as what they were then, so we never fully know. But they're definitely odd gifts. The one on the far left is the story of Ganymede, which is also a story I was thinking about when I was making my piece, in which Zeus falls in love or lusts after this young boy that he finds beautiful and swoops down and kidnaps him, takes him away to heaven, and gives him this job of cupbearer as well as his lover. And as a reward, he's given immortality. But there is never an exploration of the character of Ganymede. It's not an idea of his choice. It is just his object, being an object of affection that I was really trying to portray with my piece. And in the far right, there's the myth of, there's the punishment of Tydeus, which is a myth about a love in which a man who falls in love with a goddess who is punished for his love by being tied to a rock and having his liver eaten constantly. So it's this psychological as well as like symbolic idea of a love gnawing away or eating at you that you can never have, this thing that you cannot have and this thing that you're eternally punished for, that I really relate to as a queer person growing up in religious homes, just to, you know, again, tie it back to the past that I always am referencing in my art, my past, as well as like this history of past that I use as this way of empowerment, this way of seeing stories that I can relate to personally. So to bring it back to the present and contemporary art, this is Anna Benaroya's piece, My Blue Heaven, Legend of Rain. So Anna Benaroya's work, she depicts these very strong mask femme characters. And in my case, it's a bit more of the opposite. It's these femme mask characters. There's still not a definite gender with these characters, but I am definitely implying if they have male genitalia. And again, this idea of water becoming an element, falling through the fingers, becoming a puddle, dissolving. Here's another piece of Anna Benaroya's. There's this solidarity between these three figures, whereas there's a loneliness in my figure. There's another figure present, but there isn't this return of a gaze. There is the flower in the face, but there isn't this real sense that there's a connection or even an equal playing ground between them. Oh, sorry, one more thing I wanted to mention. Again, this play of gender that I'm playing with my characters, if you notice at the nipples, there's this lactation that's going on as well, this play with the role that this character is playing, as well as the possible identity, the gender identity going on inside this character's mind, being expressed through pastel and line and melting form. You've crossed over and all around you space, alone with nothingness. Nobody's going to save you. No one's going to cut you down. Cut the thorns thick around you. No one's going to storm the castle walls nor kiss awake your birth. Climb down your hair, nor mount you on the white steed. So this is my piece, Transfiguration. This one right here on the wall. There's this play of color in some of these ones that show yellow, where for me, the yellow was really this kind of divine light, this idea of divine light, something that emanates from within you outward when you feel it. Blue is always this kind of void space, this water, this becoming something else, or this flattening of this thing that is space or form. Pink is always this romantic kind of color, but I also correlate it heavily with the flesh of these characters. That's, although it's a pink, it's not necessarily a warm pink. There's a coldness to their forms. There's not a joy necessarily being expressed by any of these figures, but there is a radiance from them. I wanted with this one to really express the idea of an open narrative. that these three figures in the foreground, because they share color and form similarities, they could be one character in this moment of transition or transformation. The wings for me are also a metaphor for, or a symbol for transformation. A bird can literally go from the ground to the sky, change its place, change how it exists, the space around it whenever it wants to by the nature of its wings. So back to Alina Perez's work, It Never Heals. She's using this mythological bird kind of figure, possibly as an antagonist, but it's certainly being killed by these prepubescent younger female femme figures, while what seems to be a real figure in the background is reading what could be a journal, it could be a storybook of some sorts, but there are these multiple characters that all seem to share a common identity between them, but they don't exist. Some of them don't exist in the real, some exist in the mind, some exist in the past, some could exist in the future. It's that openness that I'm also translating, but I'm not interested in things like a realistic skin color to depict these figures. I'm really trying to depict them as what inner self is being expressed. So to bring it back to history, this is Bernini's Apollo and Daphne. A quality of Bernini's sculptures are that in the round, when you view them in the round, there's this sense of animation. And there's definitely this sense of animation with my work as well, especially these larger pieces. The more you look at them, the more you get this sense of it's like a cylinder unwrapped, that it's a moment that is meant to be, like I said, circular, but it's flattened. It's instead flattened. All these things are kind of happening at once. You're seeing different stages of the transformation. There's a stillness as well as, again, I said, an animation. So to define transfiguration, the title that I chose to give that piece, transfiguration, a change in form or appearance, metamorphosis. To reference the Bible, there's a transfiguration of Jesus Christ as he's on the mountain and he's being viewed by his three disciples. He ascends to the heaven and becomes this radiant and beautiful form that is difficult but very powerful to perceive. Gives off this sense of power when perceived. Two more sculptures by Michelangelo. These are his Dying Slave series. I wanted to bring this up to talk about the genitalia of my figures. There was a time when I hid a lot of them, thinking that there was this need to play with the identity of them. Again, I don't claim them as fully male, fully female, fully anything, but there is this attraction that I obviously have as a queer man to male genitalia, and I didn't want to shy away from that kind of conversation. So this is Bernini's Ecstasy of Saint Teresa. I really just wanted to show this one to emphasize that golden light, as well as the gender play going on with my figures. The idea of beauty at the time for Bernini and his contemporaries was this kind of amalgam, this kind of androgen of male and female. That was the form that a lot of angels took, was this in-between, this very youthful, but this at once possibly male, possibly female, long flowing hair, wet-like drapery that clings to this body. Really in many of Bernini's pieces, but especially Saint Teresa, there's an erotic quality to the spiritual experience. Camp taste is a kind of love. Love for human nature. It relishes rather than judges the little triumphs and awkward intensities of character. Camp taste identifies with what it is enjoying. People who share this sensibility are not laughing at the thing they label as camp, they are enjoying it. Camp is a tender feeling. So again, there's this confusion of camp and kitsch. Kitsch for me is far more like a vulgar sense of humor, whereas camp doesn't have to be like a comedic sense of humor. It can be a subversive or ironic sense of humor. Again, the irony of me as a queer person using religious imagery to depict my desires to transform myself or exist in multiple stages at once. A pocket history of camp might, of course, begin further back with the Mannerist artists like Pontormo, Rosso, and Caravaggio, just to make that connection exceptionally clear in Susan Sontag's own words. So Mannerism is kind of this elegant absurdity. It prioritizes the unnatural. Figures exist in indescript spaces. They often gesture to each other, and they reference more like a dance than they do a realistic posturing of people in a space. If you notice the light toes on the ground as they carry Price, they don't seem to have weight. None of these bodies seem to have a real weight. There's this melodrama and theatricality to them. Camp turns its back on the good-bad axis of ordinary aesthetic judgment. Camp doesn't reverse things. It doesn't argue that the good is bad or the bad is good. What it does is offer for art and life a different supplementary set of standards. This is Caravaggio's flight into Egypt. I mostly just wanted to show this figure in reference to the figure I depict on the far left. I just thought it was an interesting coincidence. I hadn't thought about these figures. I hadn't thought about this piece when I made it, but looking back, the similarities were just really interesting to point out. Obviously, as I said before with the fabric, I'm being a little less modest. I am showing the buttocks. I'm showing something that is pronounced and really made apparent. And in a way, the fabric frames it in a way that makes it unmissable, like a target, as opposed to Caravaggio's, in which these sexual aspects had to have been hidden, whether they were attracted to these figures or not, as men, as people, as things with sexual desires, they could not express that openly in their art. So to bring it back to the contemporary, this is Naudeline Pierre and her work. So Naudeline Pierre's paintings employ rich and rigorous world building to imagine transcendent spaces for community and self. In many ways, I'm trying to do the exact same thing. I'm trying to depict this authentic experience of pain when growing up with doctrine and scripture, but to say that I can use this imagery because I'm so fluent and knowledgeable of it in my own way. I don't have to be dependent upon what the power structure says. And she does similar things as a Black woman. Obviously, I'm dealing with more queer related subjects, but even in her pieces, there's this strong femme nature to them that I also really relate to. This is one of her pieces shown in a space that has other pieces from art history in the back that correlate to her imagery. It's called Too Much, Not Enough. And as for her, it's really important for her and for everyone who feels othered by these kind of imagery, this history of imagery. It's really important to exist in this space, not for validation, but almost as, again, that triumphant ha, and not a ha-ha, not a comedic laugh, but to say, I am here, I am present. Here is this imagery, and here's how I see myself existing within it. There is no one who will feed the yearning, face it. You will have to do it yourself. And all around you, a vast terrain, alone with night, darkness you must befriend if you want to sleep nights. This is the final piece I'll be discussing, called Fear Not. In this piece, I was thinking about the words all angels in the Bible say when they come to a person. They say, fear not. Sometimes because their form is frightening, it's often described as, again, very powerful, difficult to perceive, radiating light, or sometimes having multiple eyes, heads, et cetera, very fantastical forms. Many things going on at once. But I was also thinking about Lucifer. So there are these horns present in the figure. And even in my other piece, Transfiguration, there's this reference to the identity of Lucifer with this pitchfork and these clawed fingers and toes. These figures are at once kind of demonic and angelic at the same time. They don't draw a clear line, and I don't desire to draw a clear line when identifying them. So there's this term I want to bring up, especially with this piece. It's called apotropaic. It's a classical term. The evil eye is one of the easiest symbols to describe with this term, but it's having the power to avert harmful influences or bad luck, usually by the show of some kind of powerful object or this image of or symbol of power. So with that, I was using this sword as this open-ended kind of force, this very large kind of imposing force that doesn't have clear direction behind it, but I wanted to inject with that kind of apotropaic protection, something that could possibly intercede on behalf of a sympathetic viewer. And again, the flower returns in all of these. Specifically this one, I was thinking of the flower as innocence, or this need to protect innocence, this need to even protect vulnerability. It doesn't have to be just innocence. But so the feathers of the wings of this figure, they're kind of almost becoming finger-like and beginning to caress and coddle this flower. So again, just a visual comparison with my work and Naudeline's work. There's this sense of community in Naudeline's work that I don't always depict in my pieces, since I'm really concerned with expressing my own need for my identity to exist. But I hope that in the space where many of these pieces are shown, like the authenticity of my experience that can exist in this space, people will feel that sense of communion. Even if my story is not theirs, they will feel seen, or they will feel that they're not alone. So the heart of this figure is a reference to the Immaculate Heart of Mary and the Sacred Heart of Jesus. The Immaculate Heart of Mary is a symbol for suffering, a symbol of love that grows from suffering. She is forced, suffering's forced upon her. It's not her desire to suffer, but the wounds in her heart produce these flowers. And the Sacred Heart of Jesus is, in a way, the inverse. Jesus suffers because he loves. He becomes a martyr because he loves. He endures pain for love. In the same way, I wanted to express this vessel-like heart with my figure that does have a small wound that is bleeding and dripping onto his body and onto the flower below. The same red is repeated in the heart as is in the drip on the body and in the flower at the bottom. Another symbol that I felt was kind of automatically associated with this downward pointed sword is the sword of Damocles, which is a reminder of those in power to be afraid. So while I want to project the idea of, I want to project for sympathetic viewers, the concept of fear not, when people like me who use the language of power, it's those who originally oppressed that need to be afraid. When I am using this language that I'm not supposed to be using because doctrine says that I should not, or that I should not see myself in these spaces, or I should not see myself as these celestial figures, it is that power that I can generate on my own. It's not enough letting go twice, 3 times, 100. Soon everything is dull, unsatisfactory. Night's open face interests you no longer, and soon again you return to your element, and like a fish to the air, you come to the open. Only between breathings, but already gills grow on your breasts. Through my practice, I have given myself the freedom to feel things in the moment. I can be whatever I need to be when I need it. I can think about my past and feel what I need to feel without feeling any sense of shame or crisis of self. In Esteban Munoz's Utopia's seating chart, again to reiterate, rather than being static and fixed, the past does things. It is in this very way, the past is performative. And in this way, it can be a tool It can be a tool used to question and actualize your own ideals. Not ideals dictated solely by expectations or something outside yourself. Identities we form in its wake are constantly dissolving and reshaping along with it. It is a journey, not a destination, but a journey that can be supported by the lives and actions of those who came before and of those who walk alongside us. Thank you.
Thank you, Forrest. At this time, we'll open it up to questions from the thesis committee. These will be questions from the questions only. This is not a critique or review, so everything will be worded in the form of a question from the thesis committee. After which, we will open it up to questions and questions only from the audience. Thank you.
So based on your introduction, you gave us some categories in which you're going to unpacking the presentation. The first sort of category you explained as memory and history. So can you explain, I don't feel like you gave a lot of insight into memory and how that is playing a role specifically in what we see in the work.
I guess my answer to that would be, it's more of the feelings I feel when it comes to my own personal memories. They're what color and shape the characters that I make in these pieces. Like to reference specifically the Like a Puddle piece in the back wall over there. Again, it's me as an adult thinking about the experiences I had becoming a young adult, young queer person, finding love, trying to, I guess, project what I thought I wanted from love, and then not finding what I thought I could find or would find, based upon my memories and my remembering and my dissatisfaction with what I expected as a child.
All right. So going to the, when you're talking about the found objects in your work, you say that you kind of find these, it's a little bit jumbled up yourself. What is the line between the characters and the found objects, or have you found that line? When you talk about looking at these objects to find the line, have you found it? What is that?
I would say that the line was pretty clear in the beginning, and then the more it grew. In the beginning with just the Danny pieces, when I was trying to remember exactly the beginning. Do you mind if I look at my presentation really quick? I'm trying to remember how mine began, but there was yes. The original inspiration for the series, Damaged Goods, like my story of feeling like something that was being reduced to what I didn't want to be. And the idea that these objects specifically, like the dandy, who has this history of being like this, that started off this really like high class, like beautiful object that was like a sign of status. And now we think of it as this kind of kitsch object, this kind of joke, this something that's silly. But there's also a sentimentality to it, how we all associate with, some people I've heard say they associate with their grandmother or they associate it with their mother. But for me, it was this looking at this thing and seeing this downgraded status, this damaged good, this way that I felt in that moment of being called a damaged good, that moment of feeling like I don't have power, I don't have control, I just exist in this space and people can use me and toss me around how they feel like. And then as they grew from there, the more I just saw this playful relationship they could have, and it wasn't about me, it was less about me and less of an attachment to that story.
So I was really interested in this aspect when you talk about a couple of things related to religiosity, Christianity. You say that there's quote unquote an erotic quality to spiritual experience. So I was drawn to that when you mentioned that. You also say that doctrine doesn't want you to exist in space. So my question to you is, based on what you're presenting, right, which is Bernie's ecstasy of St. Teresa is very much so her having an orgasm, and we all know it, and Bernie did it also. And you have Michelangelo, who is essentially a queer artist.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Even though some people might not know that.
Yes.
How do we talk about, my question to you is it really the doctrine that's saying that you don't believe in the space, or is it the people interpreting the religious doctrine? That's my question to you.
It's definitely the people interpreting that doctrine. There's many things as an adult, I felt the need to arm myself. And even in high school, I would go to the library all the time and just read on the internet, but I would engage with this bigger dialogue of the interpretation of that doctrine. And I found things like Gnosticism. I found all these different kinds of other ways of reading that and other translations of sections of the Bible. And the idea that the section of the Bible that forbids the relationship between same-sex couples is actually possibly just a commentary on incest. I didn't include that, but that is something I've come up in my own readings and understandings of the doctrine. So I don't believe it's actually the doctrine that says these things, especially since there's only sparing references to this kind of negative coupling of same-sex couples, even though the Bible is still binary for the most part when it comes to people. So I can't speak much on like what they would say about non-binary folks, etc. But as a man who identifies as a man and who has feelings for men, among other different gender identities, I would definitely agree that it's the people and the accepted way that we've gone about talking about these things, this way that it's just become societally ingrained.
Yeah, because if the images speak for themselves, is it really that? Is there a contradiction between the spirituality and the sexuality that we've seen through all the history, right, of the Catholic, specifically, we talk about the Catholic Church. We talk about Mannerism, we talk about different artists. So you using that language is a contradiction, really, or is it something else? Well, that's what I want you to think about, see if you can pinpoint it for the answer.
Well, my intention is to be ironic, to be on some level ironic. I said it earlier when I was talking about camp, but this idea that there's a humor in it because you have an outside perspective, because you can say, I know a bit more about this than somebody else, and I can do it and live in it my own way, regardless of what somebody else might interpret. So it's even this way of sometimes laughing at people. Like it's my own way of like, not laughing at people, but of saying, I know what I'm doing, and if you don't, then you are not as well informed.
Yeah, so I think on that same sort of subject, right, again, you opened up with that you were going to explore religious mythology and trauma, but I didn't really hear you talk about what you mean by religious trauma. Are you talking about a personal situation, or are you talking about overall experiences of religious trauma, and how is that coming through the work? And that really supports millennia. Is it a contradiction? And where do we see trauma in the work based on religion?
Well, I would say that there's trauma in the work, and that specifically these two pieces, maybe not as much in some of the other pieces, but
Religious trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess it's most specifically in this one where the figure is clearly going through this moment. The original inspiration was the expulsion from Eden. So again, this idea of you can't occupy the space, you're being kept out. And now you have to wander around and do things for yourself. There's no guidance. I correlate that with my history as with parental figures, authority figures as well. So for me, it is this kind of coalition. More than anything, it's, I guess, childhood trauma, but the religious trauma wrapped up in it is growing up in a lot of religious homes. There was at times dialogue about wanting to kill gay people, wanting to kill queer people. You know, if they so much as talk to me, look at me a certain way, I'm gonna, you know. So there is definitely, for me, it's a religious trauma, although it's not trauma taken from what is actually written. It is definitely what is said by other people or used by other people to express a hatred that maybe it doesn't even come from these texts. Maybe it comes from somewhere else, but this need to say, you are unnatural, therefore I hate you.
And is that in the work?
I guess it's not directly in the work, but I think it's in the way that these characters enact the moments or even the roles that they play. And specifically, like I said, with these ones, they're both demonic and angelic, where the figure in the back definitely seems to be in this place of power.
I want you to, could you please talk more about the intersections of mannerism and camp that you discuss so much, but I'm not 100% sure I see that evidence here. Could you please talk a little bit more about that intersection?
I guess for me, the intersection is largely formal. The idea that camp plays with high colors and drama, like an ironic sense of humor, or this kind of like remixed sense of humor, like where you take something and convert it to be your own. I related really strongly with mannerism, since the historical view of mannerism is always that these were artists that were looking at the greats that came before, and they were using art as inspiration for art, not using life as an inspiration for art. So they were turning into these like dramas, as well as like this, there's even this psychological sense where they don't exist in a full space or they're dancing around. It's this play of the mind and not the play of like reality, which I also feel like is a thing with camp. Like when you understand something as camp, or you see it as camp, or you see something in it that isn't, that's inherent but hidden.
So, to follow up, are these mannerist or can?
I would say it's a bit of both. Personally, I would say it's a bit of both. I'm trying to make this correlation with them, as well as absurdity and a kind of beauty, I'd say. That's really specifically tailored to like a queer aesthetic.
Okay.
Yeah, so following up exactly on what she was asking, if you had to categorize, right, if this is, 70 years from now, and you're in an art history book, how would you define your art? What, if we had a label, what would the label be? I personally don't see them as campy. That's just my interpretation, right? To me, I see that Mannerist connection. I don't see the pain and suffering that you're explaining, right, in terms of religious experience. To me, they have a different sort of feel. What is your intention? I want to know what your intention and how you would categorize your art.
I would say intimacy is a big word. I'd also say like a queer future, like a kind of queer futurist aesthetic where these things don't exist in a clear time space. Like I am referencing mannerism and I am attempting to reference camp, but I'm not trying to make just mannerist work or just work that exists in a different time period. I'm trying to make contemporary work for, as I said before, sympathetic viewers. So other queer people feel this need to play with the body and change the body and enact these kind of melodramas that come from thinking about the past, thinking about moments that were traumatic and needing to express them in this way that I think we all do when we think about the past. We all think about them as this, nobody experiences a past scenario, like a past trauma, the same as somebody else. So in my mind, it might be worse or it might be different, or there's this negotiation that goes on with the mind. And that's really what I'm trying to depict with these pieces.
So you didn't answer the question. And the question that I'm going to ask is a more blunt question, but it's exactly what Dr. Pylant was asking. Who is this work for, and how does this exist in the contemporary canon? That's a very clear question and a clear answer.
It exists for queer people who grew up in a lot of religious households, who can see this imagery and feel the need of power that I think I'm trying to put into them.
Now, where does this, please anchor this in some kind of contemporary context.
I guess I have to really think about that. I don't have an answer right now.
I have a sort of follow-up, I think, on some of these topics as well. So you use the word kitsch very, very little in your presentation, and you gave just a very brief general explanation in terms of how you define kitsch. But the kitsch and camp and queer aesthetic are really vetted in terms of queer theory and within visual arts. So I'll add a couple things, I'll get to my question. So with kitsch, you gave us just a very brief personal definition, but you didn't give us theoretical content in terms of how that's defined in the theory. You gave us Susan Sontag's notes on camp, which is just one perspective of camp, and you didn't explain what resonates or what does not resonate with you and how you navigate the idea of camp. And then also just overall queer aesthetic, what does that mean in terms of the overall theoretical framework of the visual arts and theory? So I guess give us sort of a bullet of like the scholarly theory of queer aesthetic, kitsch, camp, and then how are you rejecting or accepting aspects about each of those things?
Well, to tackle camp, from what I've read on camp, everybody kind of defines it a little bit differently. That's why I like referencing Susan Sontag's the most, because she has like some 50 to 70 some points that are all sometimes contradictory. You can definitely pick and choose the ones that I suppose feel apply. And as the way I view my identity, I felt like it was important for me to find what I needed in there and pull that out. In regards to kitsch, I haven't read a lot of scholarly, from what I've read of kitsch, a lot of it is like Jeff Koons, which is very kind of almost pop culture. There's a cold irony, almost a nihilism to it that I find, that I'm not trying, that I don't see my work existing in. I don't have scholarly like articles to pull from at the moment, but from what I've generally read.
And then overall queer aesthetic.
Overall queer aesthetic's a tough one to pinpoint, because I think as queer people, we all have this need to express something that's very, it's very unique, but desires like a companionship or this existing within a communion of like-minded people. But the figure as something, the figure is something I've seen in a lot of like contemporary queer artists of my age, but they're playing with like physical or anatomically incorrect bodies, even things like cartooning, references to things that aren't always bodies within the body, or even in Gloria Anzaldua's poem that I recited, she talks about emptying out. The way I viewed that poem was this emptying out of trauma, finding there's good and there's bad within you. And then at the end, it ends with like a fish to the air, you grow gills on your breasts. So this need to change space and then exist in that space, or this need to constantly change, I think is also a quality of a lot of queer aesthetics.
So again, referencing the outline of what you were going to introduce, you said you were going to break down poetry and symbolism and how that plays a role in your work. So I'm going to talk about both of those things because that's how you presented it in the introduction. So poetry, you just briefly said that you were interested in poetry and started writing poetry, and then you read, pieces of these poems throughout the presentation. But you didn't make a clear connection as to how this poetry plays a role in the work that you're seeing. Were you inspired by the words of this poetry? Did you find this poetry after the fact? How does it correlate with your process in terms of conceptual motivations and formal motivations? Besides just having an interest in poetry as a person, how is it actually connected to the work?
So for me, there were definitely sections of the poem that I felt like spoke to different moments in this thesis work, specifically from what I can remember in relation to this piece where I'm talking about this idea of being both a demon and like this relation to Lucifer, this thing that I'm not supposed to relate to, but as a queer person, I see as this rebel. But she talks about darkness you must befriend if you want to sleep nights. So this idea of relating to something that maybe somebody tells you shouldn't relate to, or something you shouldn't be. There were other sections of the poem, I mean, specifically the fish that grows gills on its breasts. Again, just this, how some of the pieces deal with like this progressive change into something else. And this play with masculine and feminine, how this last figure doesn't really have a definite, I mean, none of them really definite have male, they have masculine and feminine qualities, but they aren't fully male or female. This expression of something internal that can become external because of art, because of visual art, like translating that poetic imagery that exists within poetry. Or this illogical, even wording.
So my second part to that question is you talked about the symbolism. And I think you did break down a lot of the religious symbolism, but you really were very brief about the symbolism of color. Towards the end of the presentation, you very briefly said this means this means this in terms of your own drawings, your own paintings, your own work. So, but you didn't give us any historical connotations of the symbolism of color in terms of how the meaning of that color has transcended throughout history and how it has morphed and changed to today. So what is one color that you use specifically to its symbolism, and how does that compare or contrast with some historical uses of that symbolism of color? Just pick one.
Yeah, so most of my, and it can't be religious that I pick from.
It can be what?
Can it be religious that I still pick from? Can it have a religious reference?
If that is the historical aspect of symbolism of the colors, then yes.
So, sorry, so specifically in this one, green is almost always associated to nature through different cultures, through different time periods. But it's also a reference to both witchcraft, magic, and the devil. I know in medieval times, devil was always depicted as green, or oftentimes depicted as green. So there's this negative, evil association to it, as well as when I'm talking about magic, I am talking about like this process of transformation where certain characters seem to exist in this space, this like rig of space that's not real space. Whereas this one on the left is more outside. They do still have the green petal, the green leaves around them, but specifically this flowing fabric that begins with this figure and ends and coils up to the figure up top. It's kind of implying that this is the end of this transformation.
And that's for the color of green.
Well, through some of the association with green, with both nature and like this movement into something else.
So I guess that's what I'm asking is, where are you finding those associations in terms of like research? What are you looking at that is saying green is conveying this through history, through this representation? You know, is there a religious like connotation with the color green, and that's what you have red? Or that's, I guess, what I'm looking for is what is who is defining green in these ways outside of you?
I don't have names or specific sources to pull from, fortunately.
Where would you see your, specifically these large pieces? What would be the ideal display for them? Where would you locate them? Space.
Originally, I had wanted them to be, are we talking about specifically in the room, or are we talking about the building they might exist in? The building they might exist in, I'm not 100% sure if I want them to exist in a space that's entirely secular or not secular. I would think they would read more directly with this kind of subversion of power that I'm getting at by taking this symbology. So it'd be nice if they existed in a religious space or with other historical artwork that references that imagery. But I think there are ways, I think they can exist in both effectively. I think with enough of them and proper scale. And originally I did want these to be higher. Like I wanted there to be this imposing. You had to look up at them. You had to experience them as something you have to react to. You have to change your own body to really fully experience them and become intimate with them if that's what you want.
So to you, are you religious? Your own religion, not a religion, right? Because you're using you say power often, right? That you're subverting this power. What are they to you? What is the meaning to you? Because you already said that the audience is queer, right? People that grew up in religious household.
I definitely think there's this, for myself personally, I still am in love with the idea and hope of like faith or of something existing beyond, you know, especially in my time discovering different ways of thinking and different kinds of spirituality. I've opened myself up to a lot of like conglomeration of beliefs, but when I close my eyes and when I do pray or think of like a heavenly body, I still do go back to that religious imagery. I always thought it was because of what I grew up with. I don't know for sure. So for me, they are religious in depicting what I want out of these kind of these heavenly beings, regardless of how they might either contradict or directly relate with that lack of seeing myself, or that lack of feeling accepted within the original context of Christian religion that I grew up with.
You're integrating yourself and queer people into this religious iconography.
Exactly.
Just making sure.
So, the thing that I keep thinking about in listening to you discuss your work, who the intended viewer is, and the spaces that you potentially imagine these works to exist in. Are these works activist? Or is activism something in your mind at the point of making this work? Can you talk a little bit about that? It's
Partially, and it comes and it goes. In the end, the process is really important for me to get out what I need to get out, the process I need to go through of like deciding how to depict this thing that I can't fully understand in the moment, that I need to have a real relationship with. But in the end, I would say, because they provide a sense of communion for people who are repressed, and there is a need for that communion, I would say that, yes, there is an activism quality to the work.
So what's more important, the catharsis or the activism?
The activism. I mean, in the end, the most important thing is that these provide a kind of sense of communion. It's important for me, like I said, in the process, that these express what I need to express, what I feel, what I need to feel through them. But in the end, it's for other people. It's for other people that I relate to or that relate to me.
And what about everyone else?
I think everyone else can enter them in different ways if they want to, if they have a sympathetic eye for these kind of things. Otherwise, there's different levels of entering them. If someone likes them just because they like them and they, maybe they hate gay people, but they like them because of the color, they like them because of, I'm referencing this kind of cartoonish nature, then in the end, I want them to like it, but it's not for them. So in a way, that's kind of what I was talking about with camp and the ironic ha, is that if people like it for other reasons, good that I've convinced them of something they aren't fully understanding.
I have a question that is sort of related to where your answer has come from. So in your presentation and in the work that we see here in the gallery, you are exploring in terms of, formal aspects and processes and materials. You have painting, you have drawing, and then you are including found objects, and even some of your paintings are found objects. So can you sort of give a really kind of brief description as to why you use all of those modes of making and how they communicate in different ways?
I think that's still something I'm figuring out. That's definitely a question I pose to myself in the future when it comes to how I finish these pieces or even play with like two-dimensional space versus three-dimensional space. There's a lot of stuff in the future that I want to do with them that will relate more strongly with that question. Do you want me to speak from that perspective or just from right now? Like as they exist now?
I mean, it really should be for you as an artist. Like,
For me as an artist, I'd love to have them interact more directly. Just to use a specific example, I'd love to build really deep shadow boxes, really deep like display cases where these figurines can exist in a space with the drawn figures, the drawn paintings. That's just like a formal example, or even playing with materials like rhinestones or definitely, I think the fabric can come back in different ways, especially when it comes to the installation of these items, these objects, these pieces.
So I'm sorry, I'm gonna stop here. So what I mean is, you choose these modes of making for a very specific reason, and they communicate in very specific ways. So what about how and why they communicate is what you embrace to convey something to a viewer?
Okay, sorry, I misunderstood. I was misunderstood. I think that's still something I'm navigating, especially with the found objects, because it's hard for me to see them beyond the way that I see them. But I do obviously know that where they come from and the history of them of being like mass-produced objects, things that are meant for consumption. So there's like levels that I could play with when it comes, like there's levels I could consider when it comes to consumerism. But I'm not there yet because I'm still viewing them from very much my personal perspective.
All right, so I have a separate question. So back into that conversation of like contemporary context and, you know, sort of like your intention and things like that. There is a very famous contemporary artist named Kehinde Wiley. What sort of overlaps do you see with that artist? And if somebody were to put you in a category together, what aspects do you see about why they would do that?
Definitely the need for empowerment, as well as my history with portraiture, just to use like the obvious. Could you repeat the question one more time? Sorry.
The artist Kehinde Wiley, what are similarities and differences between you conceptually and formally?
So conceptually, definitely the need for empowerment for people who don't see themselves in that kind of imagery. But formally, I am still dealing with very flat, kind of sleek rendering with these figures. I am breaking it at some points with the pastel because it has such an open kind of mark making. And that's something I do want to explore more by not exerting quite as much control over them in some ways. But in that sense of light in a lot of his pieces where these figures are very luminous and bright and the skin is very kind of shiny and rich and beautiful. And status as well. I mean, status is always part of it when it comes to these ideas of power. I'm playing with it. I'm wanting to exalt them in a bit of a different way. You know, I'm not referencing status as gold or fleur-de-lis or things like that. I'm not playing with those things directly. I am trying to speak more from that religious background, that mythological, fantastical background that I think can empower people. Not that that doesn't exist in Kehinde's work either, but just that his is, I would say more specifically, dealing with the histories of like royalty symbolism and those kind of, like I said, the fleur-de-lis.
No, I'm good.
All right, I have two more. So, in the very beginning of the presentation, you showed painting called Blue Dandy and Blue Dandy printing. But you didn't explain the definition and historical relevance of what the dandy is. So I'd like to hear that from you. And also, what are you embracing or rejecting about the dandy in terms of a contemporary reason for using it in your work?
Most of my experience with I guess I'm more experienced with the image of the dandy than I am all of the history behind it. But I definitely know that I know the history of the word camp comes from like to camp, which I believe was a French description of something else that related to the aesthetic of a dandy, the idea of like feathers in the hat or this like bouffant, and even this idea of preferring certain kinds of food because they're not messy. So this idea of kind of being a pris and taking a lot of control with your appearance, especially as it relates to being perceived as of high status or of refinement. And even the word dandy becoming like a negative term over time. Because of like this association to vanity and obviously to gay men.
So the second part to that is,
Sorry.
what are you accepting or rejecting about that history of the word by incorporating it in the image?
I would say the most direct things are the things that I've said the most often are this I mean, I haven't said it yet, but this play with masculine and feminine, at least the way we define it today. A lot of people would view dandies as very, feminine, very femme men. But at the time, they were just high society men. At the time of their coming up, they didn't always have that connotation, or the idea that being a combination of both wasn't aesthetically a problem when it came to perceiving someone's identity. Yeah, they were heteronormative at the time when they existed. Yes, sorry. So as far as rejection, I would say, or as far as rejection or acceptance, definitely the play with masculine and feminine, symbols of dress as symbols of power, not exactly status. I don't know how much of us, I guess there is still association with status that is undeniable when it comes to this idea of like queer safety. As someone who grew up underprivileged, I didn't have the benefit of like growing up in a surrounding with very liberal, accepting people. This way that privilege could surround me and protect me and allow me to present how I wanted. But that's something I desired as a child, and that's really what I am projecting onto a lot of those objects.
So, your presentation felt a bit strong, right? From poetry to listing imagery to camp, to historical context, mannerism, etc. Can you pinpoint where these things intersect for you? The what appears to have been a poem that you wrote and this intersection where as I grew up, so they're like this. They come from widely different places. Can you please direct us to the place where they intersect in a clean way?
I guess I'm still grappling with that, but I don't think I'm fully ready to answer that. But I definitely know that there's an absurdity to all of those things that, not even absurdity, but the way that a poem is not exactly a logical progression of thoughts or ideas, but it's very individual. and in that way can be absurd in its expression, but still speak to people on an internal level. I think that's what they all, for me, that's what they all do, or there's like a hidden history behind all of them that I relate to, but I don't have a clear answer about all of those. I don't have a word, one word or two word to pin them down.
I'm still
Yeah, so going back to, following up what Shannon was saying, what we were asking you. The old master works that you pick, why do you pick them? Why do you pick them? So you pick dandyism to reveal dandyism, mannerism, Michelangelo. Why do you pick them?
It started as this place of trying to retrace a queer aesthetic from my perspective, how I felt, what I wanted to see in these things, and how I felt it could relate to other people. And the more research I did, the more I found it did relate to other people that identify similarly to how I identify. And I was really trying for myself to discover these different connections. So I guess that's why I still don't have a clear-cut word for it all coming together, but I choose the artists that I choose because I have an initial reaction to them. And the more I read about them, like even when I was in like learning about Mannerists, learning about Mannerist art, I felt an immediate connection to them. And the farther down the line, I remember one, I guess I'll go into a bit of a memory right now. I wanted to write a paper about them that defends them as doing these things on purpose, and I could never find enough research that said that they did. I don't know, I chalked it up to Mannerists weren't studied, or there wasn't enough records keeping track of these things. But I still believe that there's an intentional fantasy mental game that's being played with Mannerism.
But I think you answered the question. To you, they seem clear.
Yeah.
So you have to absorb that and run with it. What your initial answer is the answer you have to go with. And you have to make that clear when you're, especially when you're writing these.
Yeah, my last question, and it's about the idea of love that you talk about in the presentation. About, I think it was like a quote I wrote down, like what you said is we all think about this idea of love as being something that can save us, or a person that we love can be our savior, right? I think that was like a very, very big generalization, and I would like for you to unpack what sort of aspects within society, within history, perpetuate whatever you're defining that type of love as. And again, what are you accepting and what are you rejecting through the work?
If I did say all, I didn't mean to say all. I meant that in my experience, it's something I've heard from a lot of people that say they had an expectation of what something was generally based off of media, growing up with a lot of like Disney films or cartoons that tell us, or even just Hollywood films that tell us love is this kind of thing, this kind of perfect picturesque thing. And then you grow up and you realize that it's a partnership, this negotiation between two people that are fully fledged, fully like realized people. Or at times there's a hiding of who somebody really is when you meet them, and then it turns out that they're manipulative or malicious in some way.
Just for clarification, this is romantic love that you're getting there.
There's aspects in both. In some of them,
I'm just trying to clarify.
sorry, in some pieces it's a romantic love, like specifically this one, the piece behind you, and specifically Allegory of Innocent Love. It is me thinking about romantic love specifically, and I would say most of them are me channeling romantic love, the ones that speak directly to the like desire or this need to attract something or this giving of a gift that expresses love. But with the figurines, it was generally me thinking of a parental love, which again is portrayed certain ways in the media. And even you think about like the Virgin Mary as, you know, to bring it back to religion, as this kind of pinnacle of motherhood, that as I said before, like symbolically, the Immaculate Heart of Mary, like she grows from suffering. She suffers because her child suffers. And this idea that a mother is like intrinsically attached to the child and their experiences is not my experience. I did not have a mother that was attached. I did have some relationship, like I've had an on-off relationship with communicating with my biological mother, but in general, I just, it was not good for me ever.
So I have a question. Where does this work go from? Is this work finished?
I definitely think there's more places to take it. Beyond just the playing of materials and the installation of these things, there's definitely concepts that I could push. I guess things that I could more clearly dialogue with that are beyond somewhat, you know, the really personal place that I am expressing these things from. I don't have an exact answer for where they are going to go beyond the formal things I'd like to do, but yeah. Content-wise, I'm not 100% sure. But as I said, formally, I'd love to play with more materials and more ways of installing these things, more ways for those figures to directly interact with these pieces in a space.
I want to ask a follow-up question. Based on that answer, are you more interested in interrogating history or interrogating art or contemporary practice with your work?
That I don't really have an answer for. I feel this necessity to return to the past, both my memory and history, because that's how I built myself. I don't know fully like where I come from. Like I don't know my background, like culturally, I don't know a lot of things about myself. And I've had to arm myself with history in different ways and pull from things that I kind of sometimes immediately react to or just drawn to in certain ways. So I still feel the need to use elements of the past, of my past and art history, but the ultimate desire is for it to remain, you know, contemporary and even speak to what could happen beyond now, like to really still think about the future as most important.
I think we're good.
Thank you, committee members. At this time, we'd like to open it up for any questions from the audience. If anyone online has a question, you can type it into the chat or activate your microphone. I would like to remind everyone to please keep any questions in the form of a question. Thank you. Right, so hold on. Yeah, I closed down the chat.
Close it, sorry. Yeah, that's me.
Yeah. Okay, Alexander Alvarez has his hand up. Alexander, do you have a question?
Yes, Forrest, to me, your work seems to be an update to old and ancient, outdated ideology and mythology. Do you feel that you're creating your own world, your own mythology to educate?
I don't think it's
Go ahead.
I don't think it's necessarily I don't think it's necessarily to educate. That's not the word that I would use. I just try to put things into them that are authentic to me that I hope other people will see, even if that is not their story. They can feel a solidarity with me in some sense. I don't think it's outdated either. I mean, I get that sensation that it's old and not as relevant today. Like these religious artworks, especially in the context they originally existed, are not as relevant to contemporary society. But they still exist from a contemporary point of view, who somebody would have no idea what doctrine is. I still think that they'd understand a sensation of beauty, as well as what characters are in power and what characters are having power withheld, who is suffering, who's not suffering. And that's what I'm trying to mostly deal with. Like I said, I'm not interested in depicting doctrine. I'm not interested in depicting specific stories.
Would you?
At the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned one of the figures as being your partner. And I was curious to know about some of the other figures that appear throughout the, like your thesis presentation. Are these characters, are they you? Are they your partner? Are they personas that represent you?
It's a mix of all of them. Sometimes it's more so one than the other. Generally, I or my partner am always a jumping off point, but I've done portraiture for a long time, and no matter what I do, I always draw. It's just a natural inclination, like maybe from drawing myself so often. I always put aspects of what I see in my physical body in other people when I'm drawing them. And it's the same thing when I draw my partner. Whenever I draw a figure from imagination, as some of these figures are figures from imagination, most oftentimes I see things that are a reference to my own body or his own body, but then I can exaggerate them or change them in some kind of way to become something more or less specific. So I definitely say that some of them are like this quality of, being an amalgamation.
Like they are kind of this amalgamation of you and your partner. And then I'm also wondering about like the allegorical aspects between you and these works. Could you expand on that if they are you or a character view? Like how these are you kind of transported through these different situations that are like the transfiguration of this person, like the presentation from the heart of this person's gift. I feel like they're all about pieces of these. I just think here.
Yeah, that's all totally true. I would say that that is all extremely accurate. In the bigger pieces that I'm exploring, I've found myself able to put more into them, both more of myself, more of my partner, more of speaking just beyond what I'm most familiar with. And definitely when it comes to the word allegory, some of them are more intentional allegories than others. Oftentimes the characters that are not human are, except for the case of the fallen, case of the small ones, a lot of them are allegories, period. But I always think of the flowers being some kind of allegory for innocence or romantic love in some kind of way. I mean, it depends. With the one over here, the flowers, hope. Sometimes it's hope. Sometimes it's this promise of. It's always a promise of something. And then specifically the wrapped flowers that I was, and the allegory of innocent love, the piece in the middle, I was specifically thinking of them existing within the definition of allegory as something that is hidden, something visual or poetic or a story in which another meaning is hidden.
Can you talk a little bit more about your three-dimensional work? We spent a lot of time talking about your two-dimensional work. And the importance of the assemblage and like the found objects, how that all correlates with your other work.
As far as them fully coalescing with the other work, that's still something I'm figuring out, because it was a very, in my mind, like temporal movement from these things that I was thinking about and I was associating with my childhood, and how could I move beyond the feelings I had in childhood? How could I move beyond just me injecting my experience in these objects that were, that found themselves in a place that was, that's not their original context or not their original intention. Like their intention to be these objects that are kind of like loved objects, these things that do exist decoratively, but they're gifts. There's something you buy for somebody, or there's something you put in your home to make it a happy space. And then, maybe somebody dies or something and they end up where they end up, which I related very strongly to my experience as a child. So as far as I'm transforming beyond that, I'm still working up to it, but I definitely think there is an openness of narrative with this piece, the way certain figures are looking at other figures, but there isn't an end in sight, you know what I mean? And just as in all of these, there's no clear end in sight.
Another question. So where in your show or do you offer reviewers entree into the symbols that you do?
I definitely think there has to be some kind of there has to be definitely something that the other person kind of starts out with. There definitely has to be some kind of information the other person has before going in, and that is probably something I could be working on. I could work on, making something that anybody could enter into at any time. But I definitely, there's an association of flowers that a lot of us have to different kinds of romantic things, or different kinds of, specifically romance. Or there's an entryway specifically with the color. I think there's definitely a pleasure of the color in all of them. There's a pleasurability of all of them. I don't find, in some of them that are more vibrant with different colors going on, there could be this kind of pushback. But I do think there's a pleasurability in the way that I'm using the pastels in these pieces, both in the blending, the smoothness, the sleekness, or the pops of bright colors.
Does your work presume, are you making a presumption of the viewer with kind of understanding, for example, the sort of identities or the roles as love? Is that like an assumption that you're making, or?
It's not an assumption.
I'm just thinking of the idea of symbolism and that kind of belief that certain things and certain things. I'm just curious to hear more about this engagement with the viewer who comes into the station.
I want the symbols to definitely be an open dialogue. I don't want any of the specific symbols to say one thing that's very steeped in like the history, like the sort of Damocles or something. I was mostly mentioning that as for somebody who knows about the story and will see this and see that I am dealing with a history of imagery and mythology, they will see that, but it isn't necessary. I, more than anything, just wanted the sword to be a symbol of power in just a very blanket way that I think most people that find themselves in a gallery space or in a space with these pieces would understand that a sword is a symbol of power.
It's also, I'm looking, not that I'm to critique or discussion, but I'm also thinking about, you talk a little bit about the obscuring of the male, the taming of the penis, but also including the phallus.
Are we talking specifically this one or just both? Well, there is an on-view phallus in this one, but specifically in the one up top, who is like very, in my mind, very referential to a biblical angel with the white wings and the idea of like the white wings of a dove, which is also very religiously centered. He's covering himself, but there is also the pubic hair, which is a very a direct reference to human sexuality, human genitalia, the nature of being a human that went through puberty. So there is still this erotic nature to it, even though he is covered. But it isn't, it's on view here, and then it's kind of cradled by the fabric. In some ones, it is more covered, but I mean, even in the little allegory of innocent love, he has an erect phallus and these kind of swollen droopy balls. And in this one, there's still the presence of a bulge. There's a presence of something there, and even this like tiny purple thong is a costume, which appears again in, it's not a purple thong, but it's a little bit of strip of fabric that also references water, and this idea that, is it fully there? Is it falling off? This play with costume that still emphasizes the genitalia.
Forrest, the work behind you, Transfiguration, had a technical leap forward. What was the source of that advance?
I think bigger space was a big one, as well as like the surface of the paper. When I really found these papers I could kind of beat up, I could really play or layer as much pastel as I wanted. And I use pastel in a, maybe not a super traditional way of using pastel. I am blending a lot. I am getting in there. I get to feel the surface. At times, I even end up with calluses or little cuts and scrapes on my fingers because I am, in some places, using my finger to blend these things. Other times I'm using other tools as well. But just really allowing myself to trust myself. And then especially on the bigger pieces, just having more canvas to work with so I can use more delicacy or roughness at certain, not roughness, but just a broader stroke versus a smaller stroke. Like specifically this fabric and some of the details are primarily all pastel pencils. So there's this real ability to layer and allow things to come forward through the direction of the mark, as well as the choice of different colors in different sections, how it's different greens as well as blues and yellows in some places layered to bring that fabric out.
Is this paper available in rolls?
No. This paper specifically is not available in rolls. It's only in sheet form. There are other pastel papers I tried that are available in rolls, but they don't react the same way as this paper.
Thank you. Last question then. Can you summarize your work?
As a blanket, I deal with the past in a broad sense when it comes to my work. I deal with both my history as well as a history of imagery that I grew up with, that I associate with my feelings in regards to power and love. It's an imagery that I feel really, like it just comes from this aestheticization of power and love that I see in religious artwork. Although I'm not trying to be directly religious with it.
Thank you very much.
Symbols of these things communicating something else.
Last call for questions. Thank you very much. This will conclude our broadcast of the thesis defense of Forrest Wilson. Congratulations, Forrest. Thank you, committee members.